Thank you to World of Warships for their continued sponsorship of this series. World of Warships is an online, free-to-play naval combat simulator where you can take control of hundreds of iconic naval vessels, including most of the ones that will be covered in the series, and wage war with 30 million players worldwide. All are recreated to the smallest detail from blueprints and scans of their real-life counterparts. Furthermore, realistic weather effects add to the immersion and change the tactics of battle. I personally enjoy aircraft carriers the most, but there are over 200 vessels to choose from. And now, coming in late 2020, are submarines, adding a stealth element to the game, taking on the role of invisible hunters, and coming with their own unique new mechanics. These will be fully integrated into normal late play in 2020, but until then can be found in a special game mode. Follow the series by playing with the ships discussed throughout the war, and click the link below to play World of Warships and collect a special bonus starter pack. New players can register with the code Potential History Ships of War to receive 1 million credits, 250 doubloons, a Hosho aircraft carrier, and 3 days of premium time. As Guadalcanal wound down at the dawn of 1943, US forces had a few more things they needed to do to finish blunting the Japanese offensive before they could attack themselves. And a lot of the things discussed in this video will be happening concurrently, but I'm still going to talk about all of them separately, dividing them more into actions that reverse Japanese gains and new American offensives aimed at striking into the empire. In 1942, the Japanese had taken 2 islands in the Aleutians, Attu and Kisco, and it's often repeated that the taking of these islands was a diversion attack for Midway. I even said this in one of my previous videos, and would coincide with a further diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands.
Man, so clever.
However, the Japanese were planning on taking these islands before Yamamoto insisted that Operation MI be done, and his threatening to resign if it wasn't. The Japanese had noticed how close, well, relatively, with not much in between, the Aleutians were to the Japanese home islands, and wanted to shore up the northern front with outposts there to inform on any offensives coming from that area. It's also often said that the Americans wanted to take the islands back because they were the only American soil taken in the war, and that made it something personal. But at this point, Alaska was not yet a state and was just a US territory, and other US territories that I assume Alaska would have the same status of, such as Guam, were also completely taken over by the Japanese. So this statement doesn't really make sense. It could be that this was just too far east and actually in North America for the US to feel comfortable about, but I'm just not sure how it could be the only US territory taken when there were literally other US territories occupied and Alaska wasn't a state yet. Anyways, after taking over the islands with basically no resistance, the Japanese created lots of military fortifications and installations that in May 1943, 1,600 men under Admiral Francis Rockwell set out to retake. Kisco was the main target as it was more built up and seemed like it was where the Japanese were mostly operating out of, but Attu, further to the west, was assaulted first in hopes of cutting off escape routes from the other island. The Americans landed at 2 beachheads, and the plan was for them to link up, then sweep inland. And this was achieved. However, it was a lot more difficult than it was thought it would be, with Japanese troops not opposing the landing, but moving back into the island, making use of trenches, fortifications, and caves to fight the Americans once they came further inland. On top of this, poor weather, bad morale, and a shortage of winter clothes further caused problems for the US forces, with a significant portion of casualties being lost to frostbite. See, Germany, it's not just you. Everybody makes these kind of mistakes. 20 days after the landing, the island was completely taken, following a last-ditch banzai attack by the Japanese defenders that, unlike many that would take place in later battles, actually overran the US line and was only stopped by rearguard units forced to pick up guns and fight back. With the whole thing ending in a 4-to-1 dead ratio between the Japanese and Americans, which was much higher than expected and than what would mostly be seen throughout the various battles on the islands throughout the war. Because of the hard going at Attu, the invasion of Kisco was heavily beefed up to include 38,000 troops, a few thousand Canadians included to help out, and when going ashore, they expected an even harder fight. However, after the first firefights ended, the landing troops realized that it had been a friendly fire incident between them and the Canadians, in which 300 Americans had been casualties. This would be the most damage the Canadians had done to the US military since the War of 1812. It was only matched in ferocity by the barrage of apologies that came from the Canadian lines after the shooting stopped. As the Allied forces went further inland, though, they found out the Japanese were gone. The thick fog in the area had let them slip away just days before and head back to Japan. The position was allowed to be abandoned by the Japanese High Command at this time in August 1943 because, as we'll see later, Japan's losses really began to mount in the latter half of that year, and that the garrison at Kisco would be needed much more in different areas that Japan was fighting in. So the Americans did get their islands back, but the entire Aleutian campaign kind of goes down in history as something that may not have really been necessary, given the fact that islands very similar to them were skipped over in other areas at other times in the war.
It has always seemed to me that the proper punishment for the Japanese who landed on Attu and Kisco would have been to leave them there. They could then eat boiled lava for breakfast, fried lava for lunch, and sautéed lava for dinner.
Other semi-defensive and semi-offensive measures to blunt the Japanese gains were taking place in other areas of the Pacific, though. One of the most successful for the Allies was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which took place before the Aleutians campaign in February, where 12 Japanese troop transports and 10 warships headed to New Guinea were attacked and destroyed by US and Australian air power, denying the Japanese troops already there much-needed reinforcements to finish taking the island, changing the pitch of the battle. The ability of Allied air power to destroy the convoy like this really showed them how much Japanese air power had been weakened since the beginning of the war, being able to pull off such bold and devastating attacks. By 1943, it became clear to the American command that the Japanese had been halted on all fronts, that their naval striking power had been considerably weakened in the naval battles of the previous year. And with the Japanese unable to move forward anymore, it was time for the Americans to attack. And two schools of thought for how to do this came to the forefront. The first, by General MacArthur, backed by the Army, was to move up the northern shore of New Guinea, and from there head north into the Philippines, effectively cutting the Japanese Empire in half before moving to the home islands. The second idea was to cut a direct path from basically Hawaii, or the southern central Pacific area, and take islands for air bases in a direct path to Japan. And American command didn't really know which strategy to go with, so instead of picking one, they decided not to pick and supported both attack plans. Something that you can do when you have the ridiculous factory output that the United States had. And throughout 1943, MacArthur moved up through New Guinea, pushing the Japanese back as he went, and as he did, pioneered something that would become the very hallmark of the Pacific Campaign: island hopping. Near the areas where the Americans were operating, there was an island called Rabaul. That was a vastly fortified, heavily defended, thick boy, fuck your attack capabilities island. But instead of attacking it, and seeing it as something that needed to be taken to move forward, they just bypassed it, cutting the island off and moving past, ignoring the garrison there, as unless a specific island had something that they needed, such as an airbase, and there were no others that could be used on different islands in the area, you could just leave that island alone. Cut it off from resupply, and it wouldn't be much of a threat to you or your big fuck-off navy. Rabaul was eventually destroyed by air power when the Americans were able to do it, but this general idea of only take the islands you need to and skip the other ones will become vital to American strategy in the Pacific. And the idea, especially for the other prong of the US offensive, would characterize their moves forward. You basically took an island just to have an airbase there and a place to resupply to take the next one. And you kept doing that until you had islands in reach of Japan. MacArthur's offensives around New Guinea and further on really bled the Japanese of troops, ships, and equipment throughout the year, and by November 1943, the other prong leapt into action. Their target was the Gilbert Islands, specifically the island of Bisho and the Tarawa Atoll. They also attacked Macon Atoll, but I'm not going to talk about that, because I think Tarawa is a very understated battle, and was, at least in my opinion, the turning point in the war in a civilian mindset sense for both countries. Bisho was a 2.5 by 1.5 mile scrap of sand in the middle of nowhere with an air base and 4,600 elite Japanese naval infantry defenders on it, with 50 large defense guns and a whole network of bunkers and obstacles of any type that you can imagine. And it was assaulted by 6,000 Marines and resulted in the largest casualty figures of a single day's fighting so far in the war. One of the men that assaulted the beach, armed with a camera instead of a weapon, was Norman Hatch, who was part of a new special unit of Marine combat cameramen attached to the landing forces to take film of the battles as they unfolded to show back home. Now, there were a lot of mistakes made at Tarawa, things that needed to be learned at some point, but learning them didn't really feel good, such as the need for waterproof radios, more crew-served heavy weapons needing to be brought up on the beach to help deal with hard targets, and better coordination between air and naval fire support with the troops on the ground, as many of the troops landing at Tarawa did not have sufficient cover from the ships when they hit the beach. meaning the Japanese had plenty of time to return to their weapons after hiding from the bombardment and hit the soldiers as they came off their boats. The biggest thing, though, was the reef around the coast of Tarawa. It caused ever so many problems for the boats the troops landed in. The Higgins boats ran aground on them and basically just got stuck, meaning if you were in one, you had to wade through the water to get to the shore, and the entire invasion was down a boat. However, if you were in one of the track landing crafts, you could drive up over the reef and get in closer to the beach, and they wouldn't get stuck, able to be driven back to the ships to pick up more men. These were originally purchased as supply vehicles so that instead of handing supplies off from a boat to a truck on the island, you could just drive your boat up onto the island to speed up logistics. But at Tarawa, they showed how they could truly shine as assault craft, and they would later become hallmarks of every beach invasion. Usually in armored-up variants, though, as the shore guns did do a number to them at this battle. So Tarawa served as a masterclass in what to do and what not to do in further amphibious landings when facing direct enemy opposition when landing on the beach. And its lessons would be seen in action for the rest of the war. It also had a huge impact on the American home front, though. When the casualty reports got back to the US, people were appalled. They couldn't believe how many men had been lost in just a few days of fighting, and were really beginning to doubt the war. The previous patriotism born out of Pearl Harbor had already mostly faded away, and Americans were now more concerned with things internally than really the war as a whole, something that isn't really remembered when we think back on it now. But after Tarawa, public opinion looked like it was going to turn against the whole endeavor, and this is where the film taken by Norman Hatch comes into play. It was edited down into a movie run for free in theaters called With the Marines at Tarawa. And actually, a lot of the footage I've been playing already is from that. It showed that the Japanese were not this cartoony force that propaganda had made them out to be, but that they were a serious threat and that it was going to take time and sacrifice to deal with them. The movie also mentioned heavily how much equipment and material it took to pull off a landing like this, reinforcing to the American people that the home front had a large part to play in defeating the enemy. Hatch's movie almost overnight reinvigorated the American populace and refocused them towards winning the war and made them aware of what sacrifices it would take to do so, paving the way for Americans to be able to accept even higher losses at other battles, such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa later in the war. For the Japanese, though, it was a completely different story, as you might imagine. Tarawa showed to them that the Americans had the capability to take on even their most strongly defended islands, with its taking making the Japanese go from realizing that they wouldn't win on the terms they hoped for at Pearl Harbor, to realizing they may not win the war at all, feeling the future of Japan itself was at stake, with the war situation falling apart and the Japanese being pushed back on all fronts, with some in the Japanese government talking privately of a conditional surrender with how things were going. The Japanese have been at war all told, starting with the invasion of Manchuria, for over 10 years altogether, and war weariness had really begun to set in. However, under Tojo's government, this talk was not allowed in public and was severely punished. So the Japanese government's official line still remained that the war had to end in absolute victory, even though the chances of that had already slipped away. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Also thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. This series originally was planned for 5 episodes, but may be longer depending on how the next one shapes up, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.